Hello everyone, I am myself Dr. Rajesh Gubba. I am the general medicine educator. In this session, I will be discussing a very important topic in the neurology, that is Conus Medullaris and Cauda Equina. So, I'll just show you a question, how the questions are being asked on this topic, and then I'll move on to the discussion. So, the question can be asked in the following manner. All of the following statements about Conus syndrome are true except saddle anesthesia is present, flexor plantar response is seen, knee and ankle jerk are absent, bladder and bowel involvement is prominent. So, first let me discuss what is the conus medullaris and then the cauda equina. So, the terminal portion of the spinal cord, it is bulged, and that bulbous terminal portion of the spinal cord, that is what is called as the conus medullaris. And from the conus medullaris, you have a bunch of the spinal nerves, that is lumbar spinal nerves and sacral spinal nerves. Both of them, they start at the conus medullaris and they descend downwards. And this particular bunch of nerves, they appear as a horse tail. Right, they appear as the horse tail, and that is what is called cauda, means it is the distal portion, that is tail portion, equine, that is horse. Cauda equina, it is nothing but the horse tail. So the bunch of the sacral and as well as lumbar spinal nerves, they appear as the tail of the horse, and that is what is called as the cauda equina. Now, if you see the anatomy of the conus medullaris, the spinal cord, it tapers or it ends at the level between L1 and L2 in an average adult. Right, in an average adult, the spinal cord ends at L1 and L2. That is, between L1 and L2, the spinal cord will taper and end. And this terminal portion of the spinal cord, right, the terminal portion of the spinal cord, it is bulged. So you have the distal bulbous part of the spinal cord. Right, you have the distal bulbous part of the spinal cord, and the distal bulbous part of the spinal cord, which is present at the terminal end of the spinal cord, that is called as the conus medullaris. Right, that is called as conus medullaris. And this conus medullaris, where is it situated? It is situated at the level of L1 and L2 vertebral bodies. Right, it is situated at the level of L1 and L2 vertebral bodies. Right. So this is the basic anatomy of the conus medullaris. Then we have what is called as the cauda equina. Right. So if you see the anatomy of the cauda equina, so below L1 and as well as L2, right, below L1 and as well as L2 vertebral bones, the spinal canal contain only the nerve roots. Right, so below L1 and L2, the spinal canal contains only nerve roots. Right? Only nerve roots. There is no spinal cord. Right? With no spinal cord. And this particular nerve roots, they are in the form of a horse tail. Right? They are in the form of horse tail. And that is called as that is called as the Cauda Equina. And this Cauda Equina contains the nerve roots of L1 to L5, and it contains the nerve roots of S1 to S5. Right? L1 to L5 and S1 to S5. That is what the Cauda Equina contains. And you take this conus medullaris, okay, this will be your conus medullaris, right, which is the terminal bulbous portion of the spinal cord. This conus medullaris tapers into phylum terminale. Right, it tapers into a phylum terminale. Okay, you see this? Okay, so this thin strand of connective tissue right, the thin strand of connective tissue running in the center of Cauda Equina is what is called as the phylum terminale, and the roots of the Cauda Equina are originated such that the most centrally located roots are from the caudal segments of the spinal cord. See, this will be like, I'll just show you an image. Like, consider this will be the Cauda Equina, right? Bunch of the spinal nerves. So, if you take the nerve fibers which are present at the center of this particular tail, right, nerve fibers which are present at the center of the tail, they are from most distal portion of the spinal cord. That means in the center what you have is the sacral spinal nerves. Right, in the center what you have is the sacral spinal nerves, whereas in the lateral portions what you have is lumbar spinal nerves. Right, in the lateral portion what you have is lumbar spinal nerves. So the centralmost part of the Cauda Equina contains the spinal nerves which are from the distal part of the spinal cord. The lateralmost part, it is slightly proximal to the distal spinal nerves. That means lateral part will be lumbar spinal nerves, the central part will be the sacral spinal nerves. Why is it very important to know? I'll explain you. Right, I'll explain you. This is very, very important. Now, if you take the anatomical basis of difference in conus medullaris and Cauda Equina, remember that conus medullaris, it is a distalmost part of the spinal cord. That means, what does this conus medullaris contain? The conus medullaris it contains the sacral segment of the spinal cord. Right, it contains the sacral segment of the spinal cord. right? Which one? The conus medullaris. So, if the conus medullaris is affected, which nerves are gone? The spinal nerves which are affected in case of conus medullaris will be S1 to S4. Right, the spinal nerves which are affected in case of conus medullaris will be S1 to S4. Right, these are the spinal nerves which are affected in case of conus medullaris. Whereas on the other hand, you take cauda equina. Cauda equina is a collection of nerve roots below the conus medullaris. What did I tell you? It contains the lumbar spinal nerves and as well as the sacral spinal nerves. So, in case of the cauda equina syndrome, your L1 to L5 spinal nerves are damaged and S1 to S5 spinal nerves are damaged. That is in case of cauda equina syndrome. So, cauda equina, it will affect cauda equina, it will affect all the way from L1 to S5 in case of cauda equina syndrome, right? Next. So, now accordingly you take the deep tendon reflexes, right? You take deep tendon reflexes. In case of the deep tendon reflexes, you have to know that knee jerk, the root value is L3 and L4, right? Whereas you take ankle jerk, the root value is S1 and S2, right? That will be the root value of the ankle jerk. So, you take in case of conus medullaris syndrome. In conus medullaris syndrome, conus medullaris, what did I tell you? Conus medullaris, it contains S1 to S5 spinal nerves. So, in case of conus medullaris syndrome, because the sacral spinal nerves are gone, ankle jerk will be absent, whereas knee jerk will be present. Right, knee jerk will be present in case of conus medullaris syndrome. Whereas you take in case of the cauda equina. In case of cauda equina, both are affected. Right, in case of cauda equina, both ankle jerk and as well as the knee jerk, both are affected in case of the cauda equina, right? So that is about the deep tendon differences of the deep tendon reflexes between the conus medullaris and cauda equina. And if you take this conus medullaris, which particular neurons are present, right? You take in case of conus medullaris, if there is any lesion in case of conus medullaris, let me tell you, conus medullaris, it contains the upper motor neuron, right, which is nothing but the corticospinal tract, or which is called as the pyramidal tract, and it also has the lower motor neuron, and the lower motor neuron includes the anterior horn cells. Right, it includes the anterior horn cells. Which one? The lower motor neuron. So, in case of conus medullaris syndrome, both your lower motor neuron and upper motor neuron features will be there. Both are gone. Right? Whereas in case of cauda equina is made up of the nerve roots. Right? Which includes the lower motor neuron. Right? Which includes the lower motor neuron. Okay. So, in case of cauda equina syndrome, let me tell you, the individual will have only lower motor neuron symptoms. Right, the individual will have the lower motor neuron symptoms. That is in case of the cauda equina. Right. Now, And the other important point is, it is also quite obvious from the anatomy that symptoms in case of conus medullaris would be bilateral. Why? Because your conus medullaris, it is a distal bulbous portion, contains both right and as well as the left sided structures. So whenever the conus medullaris is damaged, so you will have bilateral symptoms. Whereas cauda equina is a bunch of the nerves, right? So the entire group of the nerves will not be damaged at a time. So there will be gradual involvement of the part of this cauda equina. So most of the times the symptoms, they are usually unilateral, right? Cauda equina, it would be usually unilateral. And in case of cauda equina, radicular pain would be quite severe in case of the cauda equina, right? And why is that radicular pain? That is due to involvement of the root, right? That is due to involvement of the root. Whereas radicular pain, it would be less in case of the conus medullaris. Okay, so these are some of the differences between conus medullaris and cauda equina. Let me just give you a table of differences. In case of conus medullaris, the presentation, it is sudden and bilateral. Whereas in cauda equina, because the bunch of the nerves, they don't get damaged abruptly on both the sides. The bunch of the nerves, they get destroyed from one side. That is, it will be gradual and unilateral. Okay, and you take the reflexes. In case of conus medullaris, what did I tell you? The knee jerk, it is preserved, whereas ankle jerk, it is absent, right? Ankle jerk is absent. In case of cauda equina, both the reflexes are gone. Knee jerk and as well as ankle jerk, both are absent. And radicular pain, it is less severe in case of conus medullaris, whereas cauda equina, it is more severe. And low back pain is more common in case of conus medullaris, it is less in case of the cauda equina syndrome. And what about sensory signs and symptoms? Sensory signs and symptoms, that includes numbness, and this particular numbness, it is bilateral and symmetrical, right? Numbness, it is bilateral and symmetrical. Whereas numbness in case of cauda equina syndrome, it is asymmetrical. Right? Cauda equina, the numbness, it is asymmetrical and it is unilateral. Right? It is unilateral. Okay? And there is no sensory dissociation. Whereas in conus medullaris, you have a sensory dissociation. And what about the motor strength? The motor strength, let me tell you, in case of conus medullaris, you have hyper reflexes. There is increased deep tendon reflexes. Why is that? That is mainly because of the involvement of the upper motor neuron, right? Whereas in case of cauda equina is nerve root, which is a lower motor neuron, and that too unilateral involvement. So there will be asymmetric areflexic paraplegia. Right? Asymmetric areflexic paraplegia. That is what you will have in case of cauda equina syndrome. And impotency, it is very common in case of the conus medullaris syndrome, whereas it is infrequent. Right? Infrequent in case of the cauda equina syndrome. Conus medullaris, the impotency is common, it is frequent, whereas the cauda equina syndrome, the impotency is less frequent. And sphincter dysfunction, if you see in case of conus medullaris, it is overflow urinary incontinence. Right, overflow urinary incontinence, whereas in Cauda Equina syndrome you have urinary retention. Right, so these are the differences of the Conus medullaris and as well as the Cauda Equina. Right, now if you see this question, all of the following are the true statements about conus except saddle anesthesia is present, flexor plantar response is seen, knee and ankle jerk are absent, bowel and bladder involvement is prominent. See, conus medullaris, what did I tell you? In case of conus medullaris, you have only the sacral spinal nerves. Right, you have only the sacral spinal nerves. So if only sacral spinal nerves are damaged, right, if only sacral spinal nerves are damaged, let me tell you, only ankle jerk is lost. Both knee and ankle jerk are absent is a wrong statement in case of the conus. In conus, saddle anesthesia is present. That is, saddle anesthesia is present. That is because of the involvement of the sensory structures in the spinal cord. And flexor plantar response is seen. Right? And bowel and bladder involvement is prominent in case of conus medullaris because of the involvement of sacral spinal nerves which are supplying the bowel and as well as the bladder. So the answer is C. So this is about, so first of all, to understand this topic, you need to know the basic anatomy of conus and as well as Cauda Equina. If you know the basic anatomy, then it becomes very easy to make out the differences between conus medullaris and Cauda Equina. So this completes the discussion of this very important topic. Thank you very much.